Hello,
Hola, doctores,
doctors.
buenas
Good
tardes.
afternoon.
En
In
esta
this
sesión
session
de
of
Medicina del
Occupational and
Trabajo
Environmental
y
Medicine,
Dental AC,
AC, today
hoy
I
les
am
voy a
not going to
presentar
present any
algún
clinical
caso
case, a
clínico, una enfermedad del
work-related
trabajo
illness,
o
or any
algún
risk.
modelo. En
In
esta
this
sesión les
session,
voy a
I'm going to share a
compartir un
discovery with you.
descubrimiento. Este
This discovery
descubrimiento
dates back to
proviene del año
2024 when the
2024,
theory was developed.
cuando se desarrolló la teoría.
But due
Pero
to
por
work
cuestiones del
commitments and
trabajo
the
y por
need to
cuestiones de
update our
actualización de nuestros
programs, I am
programas,
only
lo
presenting it
presento hasta el
today.
día de hoy. Como
As you
ustedes
know,
saben,
our
en
association
nuestra
created an
asociación
artificial
se creó
intelligence
un
program
programa de
called Bernard.
inteligencia artificial de nombre Bernard. Le
We named
pusimos
him
Bernard
Bernard in honor
en
of the
honor
father of
al padre de la
occupational
medicina del
medicine,
trabajo, Bernardino Ramazzini.
Bernardino Ramazzini. In
En
this
este
work,
trabajo
I am going to present to you the
les
discovery
voy
of
a presentar el
Atlantis.
descubrimiento de la Atlántida. ¿Lo
Did you hear
escucharon
that
bien?
right?
De la
About
Atlántida.
Atlantis?
No
It's
es
not
ciencia
science
ficción,
fiction. It
es
is a
una
real
probabilidad
possibility
real
that it existed,
de que existió
and its
y
remains
existen sus
exist
vestigios
beneath Mexico
debajo de
City,
la Ciudad de México,
specifically beneath the La Merced
debajo del
market
mercado de la Merced
in the
en el
city
centro de la
center,
ciudad,
with a
con
slight
un leve
shift
desplazamiento
towards the working
hacia
class
la colonia
neighborhood
obrera a una
at a
profundidad
depth of
entre
between
los
80
80
and
y
100
100
meters.
metros de profundidad.
We're going to divide this session
Esta
into two
sesión la
parts
vamos a dividir
because
en dos
thousands
partes,
of pages have been generated,
porque se han generado
so it would take
miles
me
de
a long
páginas,
time.
entonces me tardaría
That's
yo
why
mucho
I'm going
tiempo.
to summarize
Por eso lo
it
voy a
to make it shorter.
sintetizar para hacerlo más breve.
In the
primera
first
parte
part,
les voy a
I will
presentar los
present the
aspectos
technical
técnicos
aspects of the
de la
source.
fuente. La fuente
The source
es
is Plato's Dialogues,
el Diálogos de
published by
Platón,
editorial Perua,
de Editorial Porrúa,
specifically the dialogues
específicamente
of
en los
Timaeus
diálogos
and
de
Critias.
Timeo y Critias. En la primera
In
parte
the
de esta
first part of
sesión
this session, I
les
will
voy a
present
presentar
how the information was
cómo se
obtained,
obtuvo la información. Y en la
and in the
segunda
second
parte
part,
les
I
voy
will
a
present the
presentar las
characteristics
características de
of
la
the
información
information and how the
y
theory
cómo
is
va
generated.
Generándose la teoría. De acuerdo al
According to the
programa
Bernard
Bernard y
program
al
and the
programa
DeepSeek program,
nos
it
sitúa
places us
hace
approximately
aproximadamente
11,615 years ago when the events
cuando
occurred.
ocurrieron los hechos. En
At that
aquellos
time,
tiempos
there was a
había una
war
guerra
between two
entre
sides.
dos bandos.
Both sides
Ambos
were
bandos
divided by the
dividían
Pillars of Hercules on one
las
side,
columnas de
on the
Hércules
European side,
de un lado,
and on the other
del lado
side,
europeo,
on the
y del
Atlantic
otro lado,
side,
del lado
which
del
was larger,
Atlántico, el
encompassing
cual era
Libya
mayor
and Asia
a
together.
Libia y Asia juntas. De acuerdo
According
a
to DeepSeek and
y a
Bernard, the only
la única
possibility
posibilidad
is
es
the
el
American
continente
continent
americano
of such
de tales
proportions.
proporciones. Era
It
un
was a
mar
sea
rodeado de
surrounded by
montañas, lo cual
mountains,
nos
which
sitúa
places us
en
in the
el Valle
Valley
de
of
México
Mexico.
de aquellos tiempos.
At that time, he
Nos
tells us
refiere
that
que
there were
había
two
dos
springs,
manantiales,
a
un
hot water
manantial de agua
spring
caliente y un
and a
manantial de agua
cold
fría.
water
El
spring.
manantial de agua
According to
caliente,
Bernard and
de acuerdo
DeepSeek,
a
the hot
Bernard y a
spring
DeepSeek,
corresponds to
corresponde
Piñón de
al
los
Peñón de los
Baños,
Baños,
which
el cual
continues to
sigue
function
funcionando
to
hasta el
this
día de hoy,
day,
cuyas aguas
with
salen más o
waters
menos
emerging at
entre los
approximately
42 y 44
42 to
grados
44
centígrados.
degrees
Y el
Celsius.
manantial de agua fría correspondió
The
a
cold spring
Chapultepec, a los
corresponds to
manantiales de Chapultepec.
Chapultepec, to the
Curiosamente, entre
Chapultepec
ambos
Springs.
manantiales, en línea recta, y
Interestingly,
ambos
the
están en
two
una línea
springs are in a
recta,
straight
hay
line, approximately
aproximadamente
15
15
kilometers
kilómetros,
apart,
lo cual
meaning that the
a 7.500
Zocalo, the
metros de cada
Mercado
uno
de la
se
Merced,
encuentra lo que
and the
hoy en
Pino
día es el
Suarez
Zócalo.
metro
El
station
mercado
are
de la
located
Merced y el
7,500
metro
meters
Pino
from
Suárez.
each other.
Se podía hacer llegar fácilmente
The
mediante
hot and cold water
canales,
could
el
easily
agua
be
caliente y el agua
transported by
fría,
canals
porque
because
el Peñón
Piñón de los
tiene más o menos
Baños
un
is
promedio
roughly
de
40 meters
40
above
metros por
Mexico
encima de la
City,
Ciudad de México.
and in
En
those
aquellos tiempos
times
el
the
nivel
water
del
level of
agua,
Lake
del agua de
Texcoco
Texcoco
and
y
Lake
del agua de
Xochimilco
Xochimilco
allowed the
permitía que
hot water
fluyera en
from
forma
the
natural
Piñón de
el
los
agua caliente
Baños,
proveniente del
which at
Peñón
that
de los
time
Baños,
was an
que en
islet,
aquel tiempo era un
to flow
islote.
naturally,
Nos
as well
refiere
as the land.
también cómo la tierra
It was
se
divided by
dividió por
means of a
medio de un
lottery.
sorteo.
Since
Como
one of the two
una de
sides
los
was not
dos bandos no
satisfied
quedó
and started a
conforme
war,
e inició una
probably
guerra,
over the possession of
seguramente
the
por
land.
la posesión de las tierras. Nos
It tells us
refiere
that
que la
Atlantis or the
Atlántida o los Atlantes
Atlanteans
eran
owned
dueños de
everything.
todo, que
They were
pasaron de
going
isla en
from
isla,
island to
si en
island.
tiempos
If sea levels
estaban
were
los
lower during the
glaciares,
time when
el
glaciers
nivel del mar estaba
existed,
más bajo,
there may
puede
have been
ser que
islands that
existieran
rose out of the
islas que
Atlantic and
sobresalían del
reached as far as
Atlántico hasta
Europe.
llegar a Europa. Los elefantes, de
According to
acuerdo a
Bernard
Bernard
and
y a
DeepSeek,
DeepSeek,
the elephants are
corresponden
actually
a mamuts
mammoths
que se
whose
encuentran
remains are
actualmente
currently located
sucesamente
at the
en
Felipe
el
Angeles
aeropuerto
Airport in
Felipe
Mexico
Ángeles de la
City.
Ciudad de México.
Something interesting that DeepSeek points out in this regard is that the skeletons found inside the airport at the time died from respiratory stress due to respiratory failure. Because all the skeletons are found facing forward on their knees, as if until the last second they were trying to inhale oxygen. Similarly, the human skeletons found in the Mammoth Museum inside the Felipe Angeles Airport have a unique characteristic. Their heads are below their knees in a seated position. Does this mean that they were sitting down? They ran out of air and collapsed face down between their knees and are now buried in the mud. And you can see it for yourselves at the Mammoth Museum. They treat them as ceremonial burials, but no, I mean, what ceremonial burial? There is no ceremonial burial of that kind. What Bernard tells us about this is the following. Prior to the collapse of Atlantis, there were eruptions and earthquakes. But the eruption that killed the mammoths and the inhabitants who were in the area now of the airport, or Felipe Angeles, died due to a gassing of volcanic origin. This gassing came from Popocatépetl and advanced rapidly, so there was no time for the mammoths to run or for people to get to safety. It was something so unexpected, so violent, and so fast that respiratory collapse was immediate. This volcanic gas that came from Popocatépetl could contain in its chemical composition carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, hydrogen sulfide, hydrochloric acid, hydrofluoric acid, carbon monoxide, hydrogen, methane, ammonia, silicon tetrafluoride, nitrogen, and volatile metals. While each of them is lethal individually, together death occurs in a matter of seconds. That is why all the animals found inside IFA and the human beings at the same time have the fundamental characteristic that they all die standing up or sitting down. If it had been due to some rock formation, they would be found sideways. But no, if you look at the skeletons, they are all facing forward due to respiratory stress. According to DeepSeek, the slope of the terrain, the volume, the flow density, the composition of the gas, and the topography between the Felipe Angeles Airport and its distance from Popocatépetl are all factors. The speed may initially have been 700 kilometers per hour and gradually reduced to 80 to 100 kilometers per hour. Therefore, the time between the volcanic eruption and the arrival time at the Felipe Angeles airport area could have been less than 10 minutes. On page 1130 in Critias or of Atlantis, it says, the ground was very high, above sea level, and the edges of the island were cut sharply. Around the city lay a plain, and the city itself was surrounded by a circuit of mountains that extended to the sea. This plain was smooth and uniformly oblong, measuring 3,000 stadia on one side and more than 2,000 from the sea to the center. But back then the plain measured roughly 555 kilometers long by 370 kilometers wide. If we move to the Mexican Republic, in those times when the sea was a little lower, we can see that the distances are very similar between the port of Veracruz and Zihuatanejo. Between Tampico and Acapulco, they give more or less the same proportion of distances, and in the shape of an elongated rectangle, as it says, that it had a uniform and oblong shape. Well, it more or less coincides with the topographic formation of Mexico at that time, around 1,600 years ago. Furthermore, it says that the land produced 2 harvests a year. Where were 2 harvests produced a year, if not in Lake Xochimilco? It also says that the ground was very high. Well, as Mexico City is currently more than 2,250 meters above sea level and was surrounded by a circuit of mountains, where else but Mexico City? which is surrounded by a circuit of mountains that extend towards the sea in both directions. Whether on the western or eastern slope, all are mountainous terrains until reaching the Gulf Coast or the Pacific Coast.
Todos son terrenos montañosos hasta llegar a la costa del Golfo, a la costa del Pacífico.
In 2020, specifically on November 3rd, a person named Cesar Moran published a possible alignment between the Cholula Pyramid and the Temple of Ejecatl in Mexico City. This is the pyramid located inside the Pino Suarez metro station. But there is a relationship between Atlantis and the Pyramid of Cholula. In principle, Cholula means the place of escape or the place of refuge. If Atlantis collapsed and everything was chaos, Cholula was the meeting point for the people who survived. But this person, Cesar Moran, finds a possible alignment. What he did was measure the main staircase of the Cholula Pyramid and trace a 90-degree angle with a laser beam, and it perfectly coincides with the pyramid located inside the Pino Suarez metro station. This is no coincidence. They were obviously pointing to the spot where Atlantis was located. It coincides with the springs, the hot water springs, the cold water spring. It coincides with the fauna, the elephants, which were mammoths but could be mistaken for elephants. It coincides with the altitude, with the mountains, with the size of the plain, the crops, with the flora, the fauna, everything together. It's not a coincidence. All of this together has already given us a theory, forming a whole theory that Atlantis was located in what is now Mexico City. On page 1129, it says that to carry out all these works, the stones they needed for this purpose, which were partly white, black, and red, I'm going to tell you that these stones currently exist. If you go to República del Salvador, there are several old buildings, but there is one in particular that I like to visit when I go with my wife, which is the Farmacia Paris in the raw materials area. You can go in and see the walls that are very old walls. There you can appreciate the black, red, and white stones. Similarly, the gold-bearing copper with fire reflections of the Acropolis itself. It is not a metal. The famous orichalcum is not a metal, it is a stone. It's more like a crystal. It is the obsidian that was extracted from several points near the Valley of Mexico. If you have seen it, the large flagstones, when reflected by the sun, look as if they were gold or flames. This is what Plato refers to in his dialogue with Critias regarding gold-bearing copper. This is the Bernard program. Here in the Bernard program, we have 3 items which are, let's say, like information files, or what we can input into the program. We're going to start it up and put in Plato, dialogues, Timaeus, or on nature. And I have one we upload. It's uploading. Next, we'll cover astrophysics. Item 2. We loaded it up to the system. In item 3, we will put part of the text from Plato's Book of Dialogues. We upload the text, select item 3, and load. The response here will take some time. But anyway, look what they say on page 1058. He then says that these stars, all necessary for the existence of time, had embarked on the appropriate course. And when these bodies, united by the bonds of the soul, became animals and learned the task imposed upon them, they traveled, following the movement of the other, oblique, in relation to the movement of the same, and dominated by it some larger orbits and other smaller orbits. and
aquellos
those whose
cuya
orbit was
órbita era
smaller
menor
were
fueron
faster,
más deprisa y
and
menos
those whose
veloces.
orbit was
Los que
larger
tenían
and
una
in the
órbita
movement of
mayor
the same were
y en
slower.
movimiento de lo mismo,
It seemed that the
pareció que los
fastest
astros más
stars were
rápidos eran
overtaken by the
alcanzados por
slowest
los
in
más
this movement,
lentos. En este
effectively
movimiento
spiraling and
arrastrado
affecting all
efectivamente
the
en
circle
espiral
of the stars,
y a todos los
and some
círculos de los
going in one
astros,
direction
siguiendo
and others
unos
in
en
the
sentido
opposite
y otros en
direction,
el sentido
those that
contrario,
moved away more
los que se
slowly from
alejaban más
this movement
lentamente de este
seemed to be
movimiento,
followed more
el más
closely
rápido
by the
de todos,
fastest of all.
parecía seguirlo más de cerca. Entonces, a
Then,
fin de
in
que
order
tuviera
that
una
there might
medida
be an
evidente
evident
de la
measure of
lentitud
the relative
y de la velocidad
slowness and
relativas
speed of the
de
stars,
los astros y que para que
and
sus
so
8
that their 8
revoluciones pudieran
revolutions might be
verificarse
regularly
regularmente,
verified,
encendió Dios
God lit a
en el
light in the
segundo
second
círculo
circle
encima de la
above the
Tierra
earth,
esta luz
this light
que
that
hoy
we call the
llamamos
sun
Sol.
today.
Bueno,
Well, the
el
system
sistema pasa
automatically switches to
automáticamente a
DeepSeek and
DeepSeek
gives us an
y
answer.
DeepSeek nos da una respuesta, pero la respuesta es
But the
más
answer is more
sorprendente que
surprising
la
than the
pregunta.
question.
Le
We're
vamos
going
a
to ask
decir a
him to give us
DeepSeek
the
que nos
reference for
dé
a
la
video,
referencia de un
a
video,
YouTube video, about what
de un
he's
video de
explaining to
YouTube
us.
sobre lo que nos está explicando. En la respuesta
The
de la
AI's
inteligencia
response shows
artificial,
us several
pues nos
pages,
marca
but I
varias
think a
páginas,
picture is worth
pero
1,000 words.
yo considero que sería mejor una imagen que 1000 palabras, entonces
Then
les
I'm
voy
going
a
to present the
presentar
model that Tomeo is
modelo
describing on page
que está describiendo
1058.
Timeo en la página 1058, ¿no?
We see the
Vemos en el
model,
modelo cómo hay un
how there
desplazamiento
is a displacement
del
of the
sistema
solar
solar a
system through
través
the
del
galactic
plano
plane.
galáctico, cómo las órbitas
Since the orbits are
son
helical,
en forma helicoidal,
Timaeus
aquí
here says
Timeo lo
it's
dice en
obliquely.
forma oblicua,
As
como
it
dice
says, there are
también
also some
unas
larger
órbitas
orbits
mayores,
and
otras
other
órbitas
smaller
menores, aquí
orbits.
también lo
Here we
podemos
can
apreciar,
also see how some go
como unos
slower,
van más
others
lentos,
go
otros
faster
van más
trying to catch
rápidos,
up,
tratando de alcanzarse,
as at
como
times they
en
seem to
algunos
be at
momentos
odds with each
parecen
other.
ir unos en contra de otros. Todo tal
Everything
cual
exactly
como
as
lo
Timaeus
describe
describes it, or from
Timeo
nature.
o de la naturaleza. El ejemplo anterior
The previous
se los
example was
puse
given to you for
a manera de
context
contexto
because
porque lo
what
que
I'm
les voy
about to show you cannot be
a
understood
mostrar a continuación
in any other way if we do not
no se podría
understand the
entender de
context.
otra manera si no entendemos el contexto en el
Just
cual
as
escribió
Timaeus
Timeo.
wrote it in Plato's dialogues,
Los diálogos de Platón,
Timaeus seems
parece
to be
ser que
coded
está codificado,
because
porque
even with
aún con
artificial
la
intelligence,
inteligencia artificial
it
es
is
difícil llegar a
difficult to
entender.
understand.
El
The
ejemplo
previous
anterior
example
tiene,
has its implications
tiene sus
because,
implicaciones,
for
porque,
example,
por
I
ejemplo, a mí
was
me
taught in
enseñaron en la
elementary
primaria
school that there were
que
9
existían 9
planets,
planetas,
and later they
y
say
posteriormente
there are
decían
8.
que son 8,
They
quitaban
removed
Plutón.
Pluto.
Pero
But how is
¿cómo
it
es
possible
posible
that
que
2,500 years
hace
ago,
2500
Timaeus
años
already knew that there were
Timeo ya
8
lo sabía
planets,
que
not
había 8
9?
planetas, no que había 9? También
That
sabía
is, he also knew about the
de los
movements and
movimientos y las
orbits of helical
órbitas, el
motion
movimiento
through the
helicoidal
galaxy.
a través de la galaxia. Por
For
decir
example, on page
otro ejemplo, en
1048,
la página
Timaeus says that
1048,
which always exists without ever
dice
having
Timeo,
been born,
lo que
and that
siempre
which are
existe
always
sin
being
jamás haber
born
nacido,
without ever
y lo
coming
que
into
siempre está naciendo
existence.
sin jamás llegar a existir. Si
If
uno
you
lo
read
lee,
it,
pues
it makes
no
sense.
tiene lógica, o sea, uno dice,
So
¿para qué
one
se
says what
requeriría
this
esto?
refers to, but look what
Pero
artificial
miren lo que
intelligence
dice la
says
inteligencia
after an
artificial.
in-depth analysis.
Después de un análisis profundo, no
Don't think
vayan a
that the
pensar
answer
que
just
nada más
pops
sale
out,
la
says
respuesta.
artificial
Dice
intelligence.
la inteligencia artificial. En resumen,
In summary, the phrase
la frase
refers to
se
the physical
refiere a la
probability
probabilidad física
of 2
de dos
dimensions or
dimensiones o
densities,
densidades,
one
una
intangible
intangible
and
y
perpetual or
perpetua o
constant,
constante,
and the
y
other
otra
material and
material y
changing or
cambiante o
temporary.
temporal. O sea,
In other
esto es
words,
física,
this is physics,
y esto es
and this is
física
quantum
cuántica.
physics.
Si a
And if it
nosotros
took
nos
us more
tomó
than 2,000
más de
years
2000
to reach
años
the conclusion that there were
llegar a la
not 9
conclusión de que no había
planets
9
but 8,
planetas, había 8,
and that they moved through the
y del
galaxy,
movimiento a través de la galaxia,
Timaeus already knew that.
Timeo ya lo sabía. Timeo también
Timaeus
sabía
also
que
knew that there are
hay
dimensional
planos
planes.
dimensionales. No es lo único,
That's
hay
not all.
muchísimas
There are many
referencias.
references.
Otra
Another
que
one
dice,
says,
por
for
ejemplo,
example, that
Dios
God
hizo
wanted
pues que todo
everything to
fuera
be
bueno
good
y
and
nada
nothing
malo
bad as
en
long as
cuanto
it
dependiera
depended
de
on
él.
Him. Therefore, he took all visible things that, far from being at rest, were agitated with a movement without rules or continuity, and from disorder he made them pass into order, judging this state preferable. And look at what Bernard and DeepSeek both say together. Plato, without knowing anything about thermodynamics, perfectly described the cosmic problem of entropy, 2,400 years before modern physics existed. And what it tells us, it begins to analyze. For example, there comes the arrow of time. Plato says that good is done insofar as it depends on it, because matter always resists. This resistance is entropy. In physics, the second law of thermodynamics states that the universe begins with a state of order. The very ordered and dense Big Bang, and inevitably progresses towards total disorder, heat death, or homogeneous heat. The arrow of time goes from order to disorder. In Plato's Timaeus, the universe begins with absolute disorder, chaos, and a god leads towards order. The arrow of time goes from disorder to order. I think Timaeus is much more advanced than our most renowned physicists, our theoretical physicists, who still think that the arrow of time goes from order to disorder, when Timaeus handles it in the opposite direction, which is extraordinary. The truth is that one is left speechless, because page by page, everything seems to be codified with Timaeus. And well, I'm not a physicist, I'm a doctor, but here's the evidence. Artificial intelligence tells us that Atlantis was actually a genetic laboratory. Where they had the native genetic principles of the planet. I'm referring to humans, animals, and plants. It says here, more or less, that the principle used to create humans was the Neanderthals, and that there is evidence of genetic alterations or genetic components of Neanderthals in children in Puebla who have taurodontia. As far as I understand, taurodontia is a problem of the root of the teeth, which is wider or was wider in Neanderthals, and is currently appearing or being expressed in children, especially in the state of Puebla. Other principles of native genetics would be corn. The most important one, I believe, would be the corn that comes from teosinte. Genetic experts say, according to what I read, that many years ago, the idea that our ancestors, using a metate or a molcajete with a stone, inactivated some suppressor genes or activated others, and that this is how corn originated, seems incredibly complex and unbelievable to me. It is more credible that it was modified in a laboratory, and that corn, tomatoes, cocoa, potatoes, squash, and tomatoes were produced. For example, tomatoes. In some states, the wild tomato is very small. They are like marbles. The banana, too. The wild banana is a very small, primitive banana that is about 8 or 10 centimeters long, and it is not edible. That type of banana does not ripen. Cocoa, potatoes in Peru, animals, cats, dogs, llamas from camels, alpacas too. Donkeys are an example. According to what Bernard and DeepSeek tell me, Donkeys are an exemplary case because the Atlanteans who left Mesoamerica took donkeys with them to where they settled, which would be Spain, Egypt, China, and Russia. We move on to the collapse of Atlantis. This part is very sad. I would say somewhat delicate. According to Bernard and DeepSeek, the collapse of Atlantis began with the displacement of the Earth's magnetic poles. This displacement caused a geomagnetic chaos that produced alternating currents around the Earth. Which led to extreme rainfall for many years in areas where it did not rain, and droughts where there was rain before. As the magnetic axis shifted, it reached a point of magnetic instability where the reversal was very rapid. It happened in a matter of hours. It doesn't say how many hours, but it says it was in a matter of hours. The change of geomagnetic polarity, which caused a weakening in the Earth's magnetic protection system, which in turn, this caused more solar radiation to enter the atmosphere. This warming then caused a rapid melting of the glaciers, mainly the North American glaciers. These glaciers, in a matter of hours, they evaporated, and they caused a flash flood or a deluge of water. But I find it incredible. I find it hard to believe. A deluge of water 150 to 250 meters high that produced the North American plains. It is a plain that stretches from Canada to Mexico. This thermal collapse raised sea levels, burying several islands that connected the American continent with the European continent. In the Valley of Mexico, it collapsed in the same way due to the glaciers that were in the area, from Pico de Orizaba, Popocatépetl, and Iztaccíhuatl. That water flowed into the Valley of Mexico, burying Atlantis. Earthquakes and eruptions were also generated by the change in magnetic polarity. These earthquakes and eruptions can be seen as sediments in various parts of the Earth. And the amount of water during the years prior to the geomagnetic reversal can be seen in the effigy that is currently in Egypt, because the traces of erosion that the Sphinx has are water erosion and not wind erosion. This is how Atlantis collapsed. And this is how it disappeared and remained under Mexico City prior to the imminent collapse due to the Earth's geomagnetic reversal. The Atlanteans already knew about this event that was going to happen, and anticipating this, they built underground shelters for themselves and their people. These are found all over the world. They are found in Turkey, they are found in Indonesia, they are found in South America, in North America. There is a lot of evidence of this type of underground shelter all over the planet. Finally, I didn't want to comment, but I think it's important. says both Bernard and DeepSeek, that this geomagnetic polarity change should not have occurred 11,650 years ago, but it was generated. It was not something natural. It was something artificial, derived from the wars that Atlantis had with the rival group, and that through the use of technologies, they reached a state of resonance of the Earth. They do an analysis where they mention that the Earth is a living being. I don't doubt it, of course. But in their analysis, it is composed more or less as if this war reached a resonance, which triggered an alteration in the Earth's core cycle, and that produced the subsequent displacement of the magnetic axis. For me, it's complicated because there's a certain analogy with what we're seeing these days with the war between the United States and Iran and the bombings. So in some places it has rained excessively, and in other places, like in Europe or Canada, there is extreme heat like never before, fires, while in other places it is raining enormous amounts of water, like, for example, in Chile. And so the question arises whether the same thing is happening as it did 11,615 years ago, which is what ended Atlantis. After the collapse of Atlantis, when it was already submerged, the Atlanteans who survived went to Cholula. But as the years passed, without equipment, without instruments, without materials for survival, they had to ask for help. This is extraordinary. The truth is, one is left amazed. Artificial intelligence says this. It says they built a communication tool. This communication device was built in what is now the Teotihuacan archaeological zone, where they collected large sheets of mica with which they built a capacitor in which they could store and distribute electrical energy. This capacitor was built with mica plates in the Teotihuacan area and used as a power source the Lake of Texcoco, which, due to its saline waters, is a good electrical conductor. The San Juan to Tehuacan River was diverted through the middle of the Teotihuacan archaeological zone until it reached the capacitor. And from the capacitor, it passed to the pyramid of the sun. This one had a pool of mercury, which served as a superconductor when an electric current passed through it. The energy it produced excited spheres containing pyrite, which is a piezoelectric material. This piezoelectric material created a vibrational field which was amplified by the steps of the pyramid until it generated a signal output. I mean, it makes sense. I mean, it's logical. And that it fed during the raining seasons with the lightning that fell on Lake Texcoco. But there's still more. Even more incredible is this. The AI says that at some point, 3 lightning strikes coincided over Lake Texcoco, and that the capacitor was only designed to withstand 2 simultaneous discharges, not 3, which is what happened when there were 3 simultaneous discharges. It exploded the microcapacitor and passed the current directly to the pyramid of the sun, causing the power source to explode and burn the front part of what is now the Avenue of the Dead. According to artificial intelligence, this same process was repeated in the Saqqara Pyramid in Egypt. I don't know what its characteristics are. I'm ignorant about it. But I promise I'll look into it, and we'll probably discuss it in the next session. It also tells us that the same procedure was repeated in China and Russia, and goes even further, because the AI says that one instrument they used to do it simultaneously was what is known as the Antikythera. To be honest, I didn't know the instrument until I saw it. It certainly seems out of its time to me, of course, but as far as I can see, only one exists. But according to artificial intelligence, there were at least 4. I hope that at some point, at least one other complete one will appear that can give us the evidence. What was it used for? According to artificial intelligence, it was used to coordinate an exact moment when the pyramids were oriented with some specific astral bodies to send a distress signal. Finally, it says that the distress signal arrived and they received a response. The answer came to them, and so they built in the South American part, specifically in Bolivia, in the archaeological zone of Pumapunku. There, a kind of landing field was built with anchors for a ship that came to rescue all the Atlanteans. This ship, it reached precisely that point because, due to its geographical location and the extra weight they were going to carry, their levitation was easier and completely extraordinary. But that's what it says. And just like that, I'm sharing it with you. Finally, it says that the hybrids were part Atlantean and part human. They were born taller than ordinary humans, and even the Atlanteans, and they couldn't enter. That's why a special gate was built, the Gate of the Sun. And it concludes with the following. It concludes by saying that there were Atlanteans who did not want to leave the Earth, and that there were 2 factions. I leave it to your judgment and consideration, because it says that there was a faction that liked material possessions, material goods, and could be considered materialistic. And those who left protected the principles for which they came and were the spiritualists. And with that, DeepSeek and Bernard conclude their participation. I sincerely hope so. Yes, it's true. I hope Atlantis is found, because it's not very complicated to dig 80 meters at a precise point. And if they do find it, I would like us to learn from our mistakes and for it to serve a positive purpose. That concludes the session, doctors, and we'll take a 10-minute break for questions and answers.
Para las preguntas y respuestas.